grateful and lucky to have guiding this work. I also want to thank the staff at Angelo Coast Range Reserve and the Hopland Research and Extension Center, where I'm conducting my work. They are part of, respectively, the Natural Reserve System as part of the UC and the UC Agriculture and National Resources. I want to give a special shout out to Allison Smith and Troy McWilliams at Hopland, who have been invaluable assistants on the ground, and I would have much less faith in the ability of this project without their support. And finally, we've been developing this project with a lot of discussion and collaboration with colleagues from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and in particular, Lindsay, Matt, and Margaret there. This has been sort of an ongoing conversation to make sure that our methods are similar to some of the work that they are doing and fit in with questions they have about management and potentially informing things like wildlife certifications or other types of guidelines. And I'm going to go into this a little more on the next slide, but I also want to finish with acknowledging the Cannabis Research Center at Berkeley, which has become a sort of intellectual home for me at Berkeley and beyond. And in particular, one of the co-directors, Van Butzik, who is also on my dissertation committee. So the Cannabis Research Center at Berkeley is a research group that brings together multidisciplinary scholars who are interested in the intersections of cannabis and the environment. So I recognize that cannabis and the environment is a huge topic. I am only covering a very small component of that today. And I can see from the chat that a lot of you have really broad interests on things from, the farmer labor, water impacts, more broad wildlife impacts. So I really encourage you to check out the site after the talk and look at some of the materials that's available here, because this is a really wonderful, complex questions around cannabis and the environment that are being approached by social scientists, natural scientists, and a lot of collaborative work. I want to draw your attention in particular to the spring webinar that we're conducting this semester. The videos from the previous ones, if they're not already up, should be available soon, including one I moderated last month on best management practices in cannabis. And we have one coming up this next Wednesday on freshwater and cannabis. You can also find science briefs where we've tried to condense some of the existing research and ongoing gaps in our understanding in a way that we hope is accessible to the public. And then finally, if you would like to see other talks and sort of verbal explanations of some of the science briefs, please check out the videos on this site as well. There's one in particular that's about my work in Southern Oregon, looking at wildlife on cannabis farms. So today I am not talking about the existing research that I have done. I'm focusing on this next component and the experiments I'm conducting at Hopland Research and Extension Center. So as an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to get us all on the same page in terms of how I am conceptualizing cannabis systems and their interactions between cannabis farming and the environment. Then I'm going to talk about our research objectives for this project, the methods that we're using, and some of the hypotheses and potential results we see coming out of this work. So let's talk about cannabis and the environment. This is an outdoor cannabis farm where I conducted some of my previous work in Southern Oregon. But in many ways, it resembles outdoor cannabis farms like you might find in Mendocino or other parts of California. Although the farm pictured is legal at a state level, cannabis as of this moment is still federally illegal as a Schedule I drug. This legal gray area means that cannabis is unlike other forms of agriculture, and that there is a huge gap in formal research on this crop, and in particular, sort of the translation of existing legacy farmer knowledge into more formalized spheres. So one of the things I find really interesting about cannabis is that the history and context influence its production, particularly in more rural, out of the way areas where farming is likely to overlap with wildlife habitat. And so I'm sort of exemplifying that with this picture that has the California quail hanging out in the middle of the cannabis farm. So this context means that we have to think about cannabis agriculture in rural settings using a framework that recognizes the complexity that drives cannabis farming. So to do that, I think about this context that may be locally specific as combining with state level legalization to result in a rapid land use change in areas that may not have had as high levels of development or agriculture. So this is part of what makes rural small-scale cannabis in different places in the West makes it a good proxy to study some potential outcomes of rural development more broadly on an accelerated timescale that allows for easier analysis. But what might this mean for wildlife in particular? In the case of this farm, they're trying to do everything right, both legally and ecologically, but even so, they've had to do some land clearing, road formation, there's increased human activity on site, there's new fences, there's noise from water pumps or drying fans or other equipment. They have lights that they use in a greenhouse during certain times of the year. Many other farms also have things like plastic netting or plastic mulch. Some of them are using pesticides. So this creates multiple different potential pathways that could affect species, distributions, and interactions. Now, some of these potential interactions cannabis has in common with other forms of agriculture, while some are more similar to things like rural housing development, and some are mostly unique to this particular industry. Now, as a whole, my work tries to understand all of these interacting components, but today I'm mostly focusing on the translation of land use change into ecological effects, and specifically trying to understand the potential mechanisms by which new development for cannabis might influence surrounding wildlife. So stated another way, one of my guiding questions for this component is how might specific practices on cannabis farms affect local wildlife? And secondarily, how do we mitigate those impacts? Now, of course, this leads us to a more practical question, which is how do we answer this? So some of my previous work looking at wildlife on active cannabis farms gave us a baseline to approach this question. So this previous work looked at wildlife space use, again, on active cannabis farms and also into surrounding areas. We can get really interesting data, including photos like this mountain lion on an active cannabis farm. And we're starting to gain an understanding that wildlife in general are avoiding cannabis farms in space and time. But there's a limit from what we can learn from observational studies. What we don't know is what particularly influences the decision of an animal like this mountain lion to use the space. So why is this mountain lion here? This isn't necessarily the typical photos we get from this research. So is it because the guard dogs were off site that night? Was it because the generator failed and it was quieter? Were they not using lights at this site? And so there was nothing like that to deter them. So while the observational data has been really important to build a baseline understanding of cannabis farming and its effects in a natural setting, we're limited in what we can learn about the mechanisms by which cannabis can impact wildlife. So instead, we can get that from experiments. When we use experiments, we can manipulate specific impacts that we might be curious about and measure the wildlife response. But as I talked about earlier, there are multiple different mechanisms that we could choose to focus on. We have decided for the purposes of this research to look at noise and light, and I'll explain a little bit about why on the next slide, but just know that there are sort of a wide range of other potential mechanisms that one could examine. So for this project, we're focusing in on noise and light, and specifically thinking about it as impacts that can be regulated, managed, or reduced, and thinking of that at both a county or state level. So there are a lot of different ordinances out there and different ways of implementing regulation across the state, county by county. What's important to remember is that not all counties, well, not all counties allow cannabis cultivation to begin with, but not all counties regulate cannabis the same. Not all counties are regulating for noise and light. And none of those regulations are actually informed by science because the science isn't there yet. So there's still a lot of room and need to understand, in particular, noise and light. The specific types of noise that we're focusing on are sort of persistent, habitual noise like that from generators or fans. And again, thinking about sort of the mitigation piece, types of noises that you could imagine being able to, say, put more insulation around, or thinking about where on the property you want to locate your drying barn or something like that. For lights, we're focusing on lights used for vegetative growth or flowering. Again, thinking about if you're using them in a greenhouse, mitigation efforts like covering them or locating them in away from sensitive habitat on a site. So that's sort of the overarching types of mechanisms that we're looking at. When we get into the actual experimental, the goals of the experiment, we get a little bit more into the realm of wildlife and community and behavioral ecology. So specifically, we're interested in summarizing species, taxa, and functional group responses to light and sound disturbance, both separately and combined. And what I mean by species, taxa, and functional group, for some of you may already be very familiar with these terms, others of you may not, just so we're all on the same page. There are different ways to group animals. So if we're talking about the example I had up earlier with the mountain lion on the cannabis farm, the species level would be mountain lion. The taxa would be sort of the larger group, so mammals. Functional group is more about the role that an animal has in an ecosystem, so like predator. So we want to look at how those different groupings respond to light and sound, and then also look at the effect of light and sound simultaneously. And through this, we hope to identify particular species or groups that might be more sensitive to these effects than others. We also want to look at distance response thresholds. So seeing if there are, at what distance we see those effects drop off. And that's really useful for thinking about things like buffer distances. And then finally, we want to look at the potential for community level shifts to disturbance. So where these individual species responses end up creating a different, essentially a different functional system occurring on or surrounding cannabis farms. But where do we conduct these experiments? Because logistically implementing these sorts of, this sort of research can be a challenge. But luckily for us, as part of the UC system, there are research sites with a treasure trove of existing and ongoing baseline data that are designed for field research and are also located in counties that already have a thriving cannabis industry. So on the left is Angelo Coast Range Reserve, and on the right, we have Hopland Research and Extension Center. So the lab that I'm part of, the Brashears lab, has been conducting research at Hopland for many years and has an existing grid of wildlife monitoring cameras on the site, as well as some collared animals that can give us a baseline understanding of wildlife communities in the area. Angelo also has a rich history of research, and one of the co-PIs for the project, Mary Power, has been working there for decades. There are also good historical baseline records. And what those do is give us a sense for what species we might encounter so that we can gauge how much is changing when we introduce a treatment. We're starting our work at Hopland and expanding to Angelo, and then are also looking at adding 2 more sites next year. Both of these research sites are in Mendocino County. Angelo is a little bit further north. It's in denser, more forested habitat that might be typical for legacy small scale outdoor cannabis farming, whereas Hopland is in more open oak woodland areas that are a little bit more typical for the expanding greenhouse industry. Then the process by which we're approaching this research, we go out to these sites, we locate potential areas that we can set up these experimental trials, and then we employ a number of different wildlife monitoring techniques that I'll explain. So starting on the left on this side, I'm going to explain sort of the different equipment that we use. So we have wildlife monitoring cameras that are function basically when a medium to large, typically a mammal, like walks in front, we get a photo, we can identify what the animal is and when it was active on the site. We also are using acoustic monitors that can record bird calls and potentially also bats. We have sticky traps that collect flying insects. And then on the right, Troy is standing in front of one of our newly constructed drift fences, which is a technique that our colleagues at California Department of Fish and Wildlife just introduced us to because they're using them as well. And I'm really excited about them. There are these short fences that you put up intersecting like small mammal trails. And the idea is that reptiles, amphibians, and small mammals that are moving across the landscape get to these fences, and rather than taking the extra energy to go over them, they follow along. They either go to the far end of the fence where there's a turnaround and they just turn around and come back the other way, and then go under the bucket that you see on the other end where there is a camera attached to the underside. So when they move underneath, we get a photo and we can also identify them that way. So this is a really elegant design that I'm excited about. And then this is just sort of a visual reminder of what species or what groups of taxa that we're hoping to collect data for each of these. And these symbols will sort of guide us through the rest of the talk so we can keep track. So now the spatial configuration of these at a site is sort of the next part I'm going to talk about. So when we get to a new location, we are going to sites that don't already have, obviously, cannabis farming or other forms of major disturbance. We set up sort of a central point where we will start with a control period and then introduce a light treatment and sound treatment intervals that will be on and off and sometimes combined. When we are doing light treatment, we will also have a bucket trap, which is a piece of equipment I didn't show on the previous slide, but is more or less just a bucket that collects the insects that are specifically attracted to the light. Then for the sticky traps, we have them somewhat more clustered towards the closer distances because we're expecting there to be a fairly close-in threshold effect for insects, but essentially at the point source, 25, 50, 75, 100 meters, and then sort of for reference at a 200-meter distance. For mammals, we're using camera traps set at sort of slightly more intermediate distances. For birds, we have the center point source and the context ones at 200 meters. And then for the drift fences that I explained earlier, we have them again somewhat more clustered towards the center. So like 0, 25, 50, 75, or no, 0, 100 and 200. Now at Hopland in particular, we're hoping that we can take advantage of some of the collared deer and other animals on site to actually look at movement and watch how different animals respond to disturbance sources on site. We have several different hypothesized results that we might get out of this work. We're expecting there to be species, taxa, and functional group specific responses that ultimately lead to altered community, wildlife community composition in the presence of the treatment. We're expecting that the magnitude of effect will be greatest for light and sound combined than either one separately. And we're also expecting that threshold effects will be evident at relatively close scales, so 50 to 100 meters for most taxa, and that the impact of the treatments will be largely absent at 200 meters. So here's an example of how we might display some of these results. So the, oh, I'm sorry, yes, thanks for the comment and the chat. I forgot to say, so each of these, the setups are replicated 6 times. So we have 3 of these set up at Hopland. We'll have 3 of these at Angelo. And potentially, if we expand the work next year, we might add even more sites. Thanks for that question, Chris. So then some of the ways we might represent this, we're mostly going to look at sort of change between the control and treatment time points. So the way we could represent this is if we're looking at richness, which is essentially the number of different species that we capture at a given point, we would compare the control period to the treatment period. And we can do that for light, sound, and light and sound combined. And we can examine that over different distances as I've represented on the x-axis. And I'll use sort of this key for the different taxa groups. So for example, we might expect that insects would be generally attracted to light, but that the effect might be most pronounced for nocturnal species like moths. And then for birds, maybe there are some species that eat the insects that are attracted to light, and so there's some increase in richness. We could also look at the same thing with something like activity rate, so the frequency with which animals are spending time at these different distances. Reptiles and amphibians could be somewhat more mixed, but so some studies indicate that amphibians could be attracted to light, but other reptiles seem to be more averse. It seems likely that the taxa as a whole would avoid light and noise treatments. For mammals, we might expect them to generally be deterred by both light and sound, but perhaps some species might react more strongly than others. So predators, for example, have been excuse me, shown to be typically more impacted by human disturbance. We might also expect them to show a larger threshold difference. And we can do the same here for sound and the combination of light and sound. And we could look at some different response measurements as well, in addition to richness. Excuse me. So that's sort of from the data perspective, what we're hoping to get out of this. Now, in terms of how we actually hope the data will be used, there are several different outcomes. So we are really hoping that this work will inform cannabis regulation, certifications, and farmer decision-making, ultimately with the aim of promoting sustainable farming practices. Hannah just mentioned to me this morning that there's an upcoming Mendocino Planning Commission meeting where they're discussing a new cannabis ordinance that might have impacts on how they regulate things like noise and light. And so that's a really good example of where science on cannabis impacts might be really useful to help inform those discussions. Beyond cannabis, however, I also think that this work has a lot of relevance to inform our understanding on the effects of light and noise. One thing that I've learned as I've gotten into the design for these experiments is that we generally don't actually have as much research than I expected on light, noise, and particularly on the combined effects of light and noise, and particularly on multiple species at a time. So I think this could be really useful for understanding sort of effects of suburban and rural development, interactive effects of disturbance, and multi-taxa responses to disturbance. So overall, I'm really excited about this work and the potential directions that it can take us, and I really welcome all of your feedback. So with that, I think we're ready for questions, and I think that means that I can hand it back over to Hannah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Phoebe. That was fabulous. And I think it introduces us just to some of the complexity as well of what it takes to try to study such an issue. So thanks for talking us through that. At this stage, I just would like to share one thing. So let me just bring up my slide here. Bear with me. Okay. So I do encourage entering your questions into the chat with this size of group. That's probably one of the easier ways for us to handle the questions. But I did want to honor a few things as we go through the Q&A session as well. We will be honoring the time commitments today. So we will be finishing up at 12. So we have about 25 minutes. I want us all to share in the success of this. So every one of you taking part in this brings your own background and experience in this. And I really appreciate the questions that come from all of those places. I also appreciate everybody listening actively and hearing what the different voices here have to say. Please do use inquiry. This is a great opportunity. This is what we're founded on, this inquiry. Why do things happen the way they do? So use that to guide your questions today. That would be wonderful. And especially useful if you don't actually agree with the perspective being shared, to found it in inquiry, your question. Focus on the issues, not people or personalities. Feel free to say it, but say it once. And please, we are going to try, and as I say today, because we have so many folks on the call, try and put your question in the chat. If that's not going to work, raise your hand, and it's easiest for us if we see you raise your virtual hand using the Zoom buttons. If you can't do that, do feel free to raise it in real life, and Madrona and I will be keeping an eye on the screens to try and make sure we don't miss anybody. But as I say, the easiest way is to add it into the chat. Okay, lovely. I'm going to just close this down, and then we'll get on with our first question. And Phoebe, I'm actually going to start with a question that I had on my voicemail this morning. I've had a few folks who contacted me in the run up to this, and the kind of the base of this question was, why focus on cannabis and the lights from cannabis when there is a huge box store in town that gives off a huge amount more light than we could be talking about in these cannabis grows? I thought that might be an interesting place to start.
Great, yeah. Also, would you mind stopping screen share so we can see sort of
that.
The group?
Yeah, no worries at all. Just give me 1 second. There we go.
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question, because obviously cannabis isn't the only source of added human artificial lighting, and in many places it won't be the major source. I think they are related. How do I put this? Doing research to help understand the light effects of cannabis helps us understand the light effects of the big box store. So part of this is where things like funding comes from. We have funding to do cannabis research at this moment that we might not have as much access to for studying the big box store. Also, depending on the area that you're in, cannabis development may be a much more rapid and increasing form of additional and new artificial light sources. And so that's part of what I find really interesting about it, is because you've got this opportunity with a rapid change to see what sort of effects on the environment we would see. So I'd say that's sort of where my interest and reason for focusing on cannabis with this comes from.
Great, thanks for that, Phoebe. Just going back up the chat a little bit, I noticed one question that is kind of based in, how do you balance the needs of humans with the research that you're doing on the impacts of wildlife?
Yeah, so I will say this is also a very personal question for me. The reason why I wanted to study cannabis for my dissertation is because I grew up in Southern Oregon, in the area where I actually based a lot of my field research for those components. And I have friends who are cannabis farmers. I also have friends who live next to cannabis farmers and they're not happy about it. And so I've seen a lot of the changes that are happening in my own home community. And I appreciate that, a lot of the funding for local schools comes from cannabis. Like a lot of the employment opportunities in an area that doesn't have much else comes from cannabis. So I'm very aware of the lifeblood that cannabis can be for a lot of rural communities, particularly in the West. I will also say that when I was conducting interviews with farmers, one of the things that I think is really important to keep in mind is that research on cannabis is useful for cannabis farmers in a lot of cases. It lends legitimacy to the industry itself. It can help them understand best management practices for their own farms, and it gives them a way to sort of communicate to the rest of the world, we're we're walking the talk, we're going to do this sustainably, we have the right approach. So
this is not confined solely to the lab for you.
No, it's not. And I will also say that's part of the joy for me as a natural scientist working with the cannabis research. So one of the very first steps we can take is learning from people who have been engaged in cannabis agriculture for a long time. I think the farmers themselves have a really good intuitive sense of a lot of these potential impacts. So I would say, one of the things I have seen from talking to policymakers and this process has been that there has been, because of that context and the history, there hasn't been a lot of communication between the people doing the regulation and the policymakers and the people who are actually doing the farming. And so I think that as just a very first baseline would be the approach I would take. And then the other place that you can look are existing studies on other forms of agriculture, and then sort of expert best guess of the scientists themselves. We've got a set of hypotheses, for instance, for this research that's based on some of the existing studies that we've either conducted ourselves or other people have done. We may be wrong though, so that's the important part of doing the research itself. So I guess that would be my approach: is start with the farmers, look to existing research, and make informed guesses.
Excellent. Thanks for that question, Ron, and thanks, Phoebe, for the answer. This is a nice follow-on from that, actually, Phoebe. Paul Hansberry was asking, do you think this research complements or complicates the CEQA process?
Maybe a bit of both. So part of why we are trying to work with California Department of Fish and Wildlife, who sort of is a lot of who sort of guides the CEQA process, is in order to help them inform those regulations. But the other piece that can sometimes be complicating is when CEQA ends up being really rigid in terms of what it requires, that may prevent some more creative problem solving around wildlife impacts. I am not an expert in CEQA, so I don't know all of the intricacies about the ways in which it would influence and be impacted by this rule. So that's part of why I talk with people who know more about policy than I do. But I hope that it complements it, I'll put it that way, or the places that it needs complication.
Yeah,
hopefully we can add that.
So there are two questions that came up, both about timelines, which I know you're very well versed in. So what's the kind of timeline between the kind of inception of your study and then actually getting the results? And also, how long has this study been going on in Mendocino County?
Yeah, so timeline, I will say everything got a little bit more complicated with COVID. I actually moved out here about a year ago, intending to start getting things rolling a year ago, and we're just getting things rolling now. So everything's been a little bit more delayed than I would ideally like with this process. I'll be honest on that. We're looking to conduct these experiments over the next 2 years and analyze a little bit as we go. However, the full set of data, I wouldn't necessarily expect to have results out and published and publicly available until another couple years after that. I will say, from my own personal perspective, I'm hoping to get some like very preliminary research incorporated as soon as possible, especially because we've been talking with California Department of Fish and Wildlife, who are sort of exploring some options for helping inform wildlife conscious certifications in the state. And so even our like very preliminary results can feed into something like that.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Phoebe. And here's another question that goes right to the core of what you're working with. The audio moth sounds cool. Can you tell us more about that device? Where can one find or purchase these? And that's from Scott Watkins.
Yeah, they're really amazing. So traditionally, the sort of acoustic recorders for birds and bats have been large and very expensive, and a little bit difficult to operate. These audio mods are sort of a new device that has come out of, I will have to look it up, sort of a maker space lab that's trying to get it very pared down and more affordable for researchers, which I really appreciate because they're still a little bit complicated to use. As you can see, they don't have like a real housing. They just recently released housing for them, which makes them a little bit easier to use, but you have to like set them up, configure them on the computer first before you deploy them, and they don't like to be bumped when you're like setting them up, and so they can be a little tricky, but I'm really excited about them. My lab mate Kendall Calhoun, who actually has done another one of these webinars, is much more well versed than I am in the actual processing of the audio and analysis, but essentially you set it to record at certain periods, and then you get an audio file that you can first pass run through like an automatic classifier, and then go through and help it make sure that it's correctly identifying the bird calls.
Thanks for that, Phoebe. And if folks are interested in Kendall's research here, looking at wildlife response to wildfire, you can find a recording of that webinar on our YouTube, which is in the chat as well. So let's see. I see Asa, one of our wonderful California naturalists. Nice to see you here, Asa. Asa Spade commented, I'm a biological consultant, and I'll be working on doing biological surveys for cannabis programs and making mitigation recommendations. Do you have preliminary results that we can use now, or sources for more information?
I guess I would refer you to the CRC website again, and especially those science briefs, and maybe also if it's up online right now, the recording from the best management practices webinar that we did last month. These experiments, we have pilot data collection right now. We're not pilot, sorry, control period data collection right now. So pre-treatment. So we don't have any preliminary data yet. But I think some of those other resources should be useful on that front, and feel free to send me an email if you have follow-up questions as well.
Okay, then we have a question from Adina Maranlander, who actually works with us here at the Hopland Research and Extension Center. The growth focused on here in the working wildland area where wildlife can hopefully still persist. I think a statement more from Adina there, which is a good point. Anything you'd like to add there? Phoebe or Adina? Adina, if you'd like to add anything, we'd love to have you.
I was just adding that way back in the discussion about the Walmart lighting versus like a wildland setting. I think they're really different objectives. I mean, hopefully we're not putting Walmarts out in the middle of wildlife areas.
Yeah.
So
thank you for good clarification. Yeah. I appreciate that.
Really important that we get a handle on disturbance in our even our wildland interface areas, as well as our working landscapes and wildlands. So thanks, Phoebe.
Thanks, Adina.
Adina. Acer, I see a hand raised there. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add real quick that just the phase 1 cannabis permittees, there are 1,100 farms that are said to exist before 2016 that are getting permitted right now. So, versus one Walmart on the edge of town, 1,100 grows mostly in the boonies. So there's a big difference there too.
Yeah. Van Butzik had a postdoc named Jared, I'm trying to remember his last name right now, who was doing some preliminary analyses, and I don't really know that they ever followed up with this, but that was trying to look at the relationship between new greenhouse sites and measurements of like sky glow. The data for sort of nighttime lights is pretty coarse, what's available for research access, but it seemed to be a pretty surprisingly tight correlation over time, the increased sky glow in sort of Northern California counties and the increase in greenhouse production. But that's obviously very correlative, and the scale wasn't quite fine enough to sort of draw, I think, a causative link.
All right, let's go back in. I see some more in the chat here. Thanks to everybody for these fabulous questions. So I see one here. I'd like to learn more about the research focus on the remediation capabilities of cannabis to restore habitat and clean soils. You mentioned the quails in the garden. Many gardens in my area focus on the compatibility of cannabis as an inactive species.
Yeah, I think there is a huge opportunity for cannabis to be a form of agriculture that can coexist with wildlife. You know, I think when we look at sort of the research out there on land sharing and agricultural practices that can promote biodiversity on site itself, I think, to me, there's no reason why small scale cannabis can't fit into that model. Let's see, what was the other sort of habitat restoration? Mm-hmm. I haven't seen very much on sort of specific restoration actions, partially because at the moment I'm more familiar with cannabis, sort of not necessarily moving into land that has already previously been degraded. But I've certainly heard people talk about, you know, hemp plants and their ability to draw toxins out of the soil, but then of course you can't consume that product then. So it's maybe a slightly different use of the plant. Sorry, my cat is meowing. But I will say that some of the discussions around things like wildlife friendly certifications with cannabis are obviously sort of predicated on the assumption that there are ways of farming that can coexist with wildlife. And especially thinking about sort of what Adina was talking about with these working lands and cannabis, that fits in with sort of that concept of how do we, in areas that are, you know, supporting rural livelihoods, how do we simultaneously support biodiversity and wildlife?
Excellent. Thanks so much, Phoebe. So I see we have 8 minutes. I'm going to try and get through these questions that we still have in the chat. For folks who don't get their question aired while we're on the webinar now, Phoebe has shared her contact information and you will be welcome to reach out directly to her or indeed to myself and Madrona. Madrona, maybe you would be willing to put our contact information in the chat too, or at least mine. Thank you so much. So from Seth LaRosa, what is the scale of your treatment area? Are you replicating the noise and light disturbance created by a larger industrial scale operation or something smaller?
Yeah, so our actual treatments are going to be definitely smaller than what you would find on a large scale industrial farm. However, that gives us a sort of a baseline that I think will hopefully be useful even for those larger industrial sites. In an ideal world, we would sort of find out what the scaling factor is. Like if, you know, this wattage of this number of lights leads to impact out at this distance. If you increase it by how much more, or how farther out does the impact? So we don't necessarily know about that, the scaling factor. That would sort of be maybe the next step of research. But I am hoping that this will still be useful for those larger scale production sites, but it's definitely going to mimic more of what you would see on a smaller scale farm.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Here's one that I'm hoping you can shed some light on, Phoebe, but we may need to look further. Wondering about the school funding comment. This is from Adina again. Have local or state tax funds for schools increased since legalization? Is that something you have any knowledge on, Phoebe?
I don't know that specifically, and I suspect that it's going to be sort of more local in terms of what those influences are. That would be that's
interesting.
That's also, I think, a question that other folks at the Cannabis Research Center, I think, have started to look at, but that it's something that I am personally interested in sort of the economic contribution of cannabis to local communities and economies. Yeah.
And here's a question that actually ties in quite neatly to our upcoming series of climate change events, which is going to start on the 25th of March with one of your colleagues from the Cannabis Research Center, Dr. Ted Grantham. So we will add that in the chat as well. Madrona, I wonder if we can make sure we add a link to that. So how do you compensate in your studies with the ongoing changes in biodiversity due to climate change?
Yeah, so I'd say we're probably more likely to have to deal with sort of seasonal changes. So over the course of a 2-year study, the difference between wildlife that's on the site in the winter versus the summer is probably going to be more something we have to account for than the change between year 1 and year 2. So I would say we're not specifically addressing anything related to climate change at this moment, but using the cycling, treatment, and control cycles helps us get at differences within a season. Yeah. Sorry, I just got a little bit of sound feedback.
Yeah, no worries at all. That's great. So I'm just going to move through some of these, knowing that we only have a few minutes left. Is it safe to assume hemp farms would have the same impacts? Have you, or will you be studying hemp farms as well?
It depends on the style of cultivation. So there are certainly a lot of similarities with hemp farms, but there are also some different practices. I would think that probably the noise impacts are going to be more relevant for most hemp farmers, just because they still often have the sort of drying barns on site, or the probably less like specifically generator noise, but there's generally a little bit more large noise making equipment involved in that, just because they tend to be more scaled up. But it really depends on the farmer. I mean, I think some hemp farmers are coming from cannabis, and so bring a lot of the same production practices in the same areas, whereas some people are coming into hemp from a different agricultural background and bring with them different practices. So I think hemp definitely complicates the picture, and also because it's regulated really differently, at least in Oregon. So I have touched just a little bit on hemp, but it is a complicating system that I haven't really figured out exactly how to mesh with the work that I've done so far.
Excellent. So we've just got a couple of minutes. I think we'll maybe get 1 or 2 more questions in. Now here's one that I feel like we've seen a few questions along the same vein, so I'm hoping it will gather together those ones. Can some small cannabis farms practicing best management practices actually help wildlife?
So I suspect that it depends on where you are and what species we're talking about. So I certainly think that what we've seen, again, with sort of some of these other studies in places like Costa Rica, for instance, and sort of biodiversity on farm sites, I think it's reasonable to assume that if you are not using heavy pesticide loads, for instance, that you can probably increase bird diversity with things like intercropping, and adding sort of native species to your site as well. I just recently was looking at some pictures people put up on Reddit of these hummingbirds that were getting attracted to their cannabis and flowers. And so I think there is a possibility to actually see an increase in biodiversity on cannabis farms. But then, some animals are likely to not necessarily ever respond that well to human disturbance. So when we're talking about, this is part of why I was really surprised at getting that mountain lion photo, because typically large animals, large predators have a bit more difficulty coexisting on a site, especially if your county regulates that you have to have a fence around it. So I think there is definitely for some species, some taxa, I think there's a really great opportunity for cannabis to increase biodiversity. I think we have to be aware that there are some species that have maybe a bit more hard limits on the types of disturbance and therefore the types of coexistence opportunities that they'll have with cannabis.
Excellent. And I see further down the chat, Anira or Anira, I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong there. That's something that you're really interested in and would like to see if there was a way to connect farmers to consider how they could encourage biodiversity. So we will reach back out to you to see if there's any other ways that we can connect you with resources there. And at that point, it's 12. Phoebe, I want to make sure I have just a minute to say a absolutely massive thank you to you. Your research is so thoughtful, and your appreciation and your deep rootedness in this issue of having a personal stake in it as well, I think really resonates. And I just want to appreciate the work that you're doing and how it's actually going to be supporting the decisions that are being made. So thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I really had fun with this.
Great. And as I mentioned, we will be posting the video of Phoebe's webinar on our YouTube page, which is in the chat, and I will email around the links which we've seen in the chat to everybody who signed up for the webinar. So thanks all for showing up today. We look forward to seeing you for our next webinar. Bye-bye.